Even the most established brand rarely, if ever, has 100% customer retention. And I think brands get caught in the trap of, well, what are we doing in paid media?
It is not hard to lose them. If you're not paying to remarket to your past purchasers, they're gonna go somewhere else. There's too many options, there's too many deals, there's too many discounts.
What mistakes do you see they're making in terms of how they're leveraging their ad strategy?
I think a lot of brands want to sit on top 500 hooks of 2025. A lot of brands are lazy in their briefing.
Today on the pod, we'll be talking to Sam Davel. Sam is managing director at the Rubix Agency. Sam's background is in startups, so we'll be able to talk about the interesting relationship between startups and enterprise and what enterprise organizations can learn from the startup world. For example, we're going to talk about the importance of speed of execution in the startup world and how enterprises can take advantage of that by finding that sweet spot in timing. Then we'll talk about the importance of returning customers because you can't just grow on new customers. In addition, we'll talk about big swings that need to be taken in the startup world and how enterprises can learn from that experimentation methodology and how they too can take those kinds of big swings. It's going to be really interesting. Let's get started. Sam, thanks so much for joining us today. We're very excited to have you on the podcast.
I appreciate that, Shamir. Thank you guys for having me on, and I'm super excited to chat about marketing.
What's great about having you on is you bring such a different perspective. A lot of the guests that we have in our audience is really focused on the enterprise market, but here you bring this perspective of having worked with startups. And sometimes we think that world is so markedly different than the enterprise, but there really is a lot of crossover. And even the differences are things that we can very much learn from across the enterprise in terms of how we market there in that particular space. So I think your perspective is going to be super powerful for our guests, which is why I'm so excited to talk to you today. So I guess first thing would be to see kind of your perspective on those differences. What are some things that you think you do or that you've learned from working with Series A, Series B startups that often get forgotten about in the enterprise space?
Yeah, awesome. I think the thing that really stands out the most to me is the speed at which startups move. They just move extremely fast in marketing. They don't have the funds or the time like an enterprise brand to say, hey, we're testing this out over the next 6 months and let's see how it goes. Sometimes funds are extremely limited and you have to make a call before you have statistical significance. And so you really have to kind of trust your gut and where something's moving towards. We've made calls on tests that we've ran with, 25 results or 30 results because we just don't have the funds or the ability to wait around and see if we're right or wrong or to a certain point where we're really confident about it. That's I think the biggest thing. And then in that same breath, it's on the opposite side. I think startups also need to learn to give things a little bit more time. Oftentimes I had it this week, we launched a campaign on Meta and, first 3 days are no conversions. It's taking its time. And then day 4, it picks up. All of a sudden we're at a 2X. Day 5, we're at a 3X. Day 6, it takes time, but that's just a short example. A lot of stuff in marketing takes time and you got to give it time to get your results back. So it's balancing those two things of having significant results and trusting them and being able to balance the spend on it.
Sometimes marketers will find a way to find that sweet spot, but then you get bogged down in the minutia of the day-to-day and you kind of lose sight of that, right? Especially when you start working for a larger company. So whether it's a startup that's just growing very quickly and becomes an enterprise company, or maybe you're starting a role and you're in more of a legacy enterprise organization, and that mentality of learning and failing fast, of iterating very, very quickly, far too quickly gets lost, right? And you're not able to pivot the way you want to. And people often use the analogy of turning a cruise ship, right? Of turning the Titanic. And it's interesting to use the analogy of a Titanic, considering, what happened to the Titanic, right? So that importance of constantly iterating and constantly learning really comes into play. I'm kind of curious, we've talked before a little bit about your background as an Army Ranger. Do you think that background gives you a particular perspective that's been helpful to you in having the proper mentality as you kind of go into these marketing initiatives?
Yeah, I definitely think it has, kind of in a roundabout sense. I think one thing that helped me, especially really early in my career, is kind of just an intense passion for the work. And so early on in my career, where I didn't necessarily have the knowledge that I do now, I was just so curious about stuff. And I would spend so much time diving into, Meta says this, but does GA4, agree with that? Okay, GA4 does, but what does Shopify say? Like really diving in and taking a look at it. Whereas I met a lot of young marketers early in my career that are, oh, well, Meta says we have a 3X, so we have a 3X. And it's like, well, are we seeing that on the back end? What are we seeing in Shopify? What are we seeing on GA4? Is our traffic increase? Like that type of thing, I think coming from, a special operations background where we don't settle for, oh, it looks like this. Like we can't settle for that. And so when I got early in my career, I just had that in me where I was not going to settle for, oh, it says it's a 3X, so it's a 3X. And that helped me really early on. And then I think the other thing is, in coming from a special operations background, your ability to handle stress is a little bit different. And so when there are moments in the marketing world, like of, where, especially working with young brands, where you have fires, it's at a point where I don't panic in that sense. I'm very task oriented and problem solution oriented. And so coming from that background, it's very, okay, here's the fire. How do we put it out? What do we have to do instead of having that panic moment? So I think those are kind of the two biggest things that have helped me, especially early in my career, coming from the military background.
Those are two great lessons. Just to talk about those kind of in reverse order, that idea of being very reactive is something that, again, often plagues marketers. We become so reactive to what's happening in the marketplace, to what competitors are doing, or how the market is shifting, or the needs and goals of a company, of leadership in terms of what numbers need to be hit. And we just start kind of making decisions instead of kind of thinking things through and saying, okay, like, what am I doing here? Why am I doing it? What's the outcome going to be? How am I going to measure that outcome effectively, right? And kind of going through that process. It's not that you need to take, 3 weeks to figure that all out, but just kind of stopping for a moment, to your point, keeping calm, keeping your senses and wits about you, and kind of saying, okay, let's think about this logically and analytically in terms of how I'm going to do this and how I'm going to execute, why I'm doing it, asking the appropriate questions of leadership of like, is that really what you're worried about here? Is it this number you want to hit? Or is this a market share issue? Are you trying to get market share, right? Are you trying to save margin? Like, what is it exactly you're trying to accomplish, right? Really gain the context of that question so that you as a marketer can bring your experience and your perspective and say, well, if that's the problem we're trying to solve, then this is probably the best way to solve it, right? So being able to kind of slow down and keep your wits is super important. Is that something where you've had to have that kind of that discourse with leadership of kind of saying, hey, help me understand what you're trying to do and what the problem is you're trying to solve. Don't come to me with a solution. Allow me to leverage my expertise and give you that solution.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially working with Series A and Series B brands, they don't have the teams in place to really understand what they have to do to get what they want. And so, an example is I've worked with a lot of brands who will come to me and say, hey, we want to increase our revenue. And it's like, okay, great. Well, do you want to increase that from a new customer standpoint, or do we know how many returning customers do you have? And it's, oh, well, we want to increase our revenue. And it's like, okay, well, we've got to have these conversations now to figure out where you're coming from and where you really want to go, as opposed to working with, an enterprise. You have a full marketing team. And so when somebody comes to you and they go, and they also have the metrics built out. So they come to you and they go, hey, returning revenue over the last quarter is down 15%. Then it's easy to go, okay, great. Returning revenue is down. We know the levers that we need to pull to bring that up. Whereas I have a lot of founders come to me with, hey, we want to grow year over year. Great. Awesome. Where do you want to grow? And that is the kind of the puzzle piece that we have to figure out together to then go and build a strategy off of it.
What you're saying is resonating with a lot of our listeners, because even though it may be an enterprise organization, even though it may be a strong team, I guarantee you there are several CMOs, CROs, VPs of marketing that are coming to their team and saying the exact same thing. They're being very generic, they're being very broad, and those marketing experts have to kind of dig in and say, what exactly are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? Where is the problem that we're trying to solve for? Because sometimes that infrastructure isn't there, that data isn't there, or maybe people in leadership aren't looking at that data, right? And they're not getting that perspective. Maybe they're so kind of disconnected from it, that they're just seeing the broader, higher numbers and just kind of giving a directive instead of kind of understanding, okay, well, where in the numbers is this problem? And that kind of brings me to the second point you made in terms of what you learned from your background. And that's the importance of saying, hey, let's validate. Let's not just take for granted what numbers are being kind of spit back at me, especially by the ad platforms, right? Because we have to remember these are businesses. Meta, Google, LinkedIn, these are businesses. And they're in the business to make money. And we'd be fooling ourselves to think that they're not trying to paint themselves in the best possible light. I mean, that's what they're in business to do, right? They're trying to incentivize you, to motivate you to spend more money with them, to position themselves as the solution to your problem, right? That's the best thing they can do. And that's a lot of what we talk about in the pod is that, hey, advertising is a big component of what you need to do, but then there's this whole experience that happens after where people actually make the decision and take the action. So you've got to balance those things. And that seems like probably a challenge that you have because you have a very different perspective that I really want to dig into here. You have this idea of really not so much even product-led marketing, but really kind of product-led advertising, right? Where you have to begin to kind of take what would typically be in that post-click experience, and you have to begin to expose that in the pre-click experience to be able to get that person to kind of pull them in and engage because of the nature of your product. Can you talk about that a little bit for me?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this idea really started off with working with early stage brands in the sense of they don't have necessarily the budget to work with a true traditional top of funnel, middle of funnel, bottom of funnel advertising structure. And so they would, come to us and say, "Hey, we want to spend $20,000 and all of that needs to be working to drive purchases kind of immediately because we don't have a runway of 6 months." And so really, early on, it was, okay, great. Then we need to get to a point where people are ready to purchase as soon as they click through the ad. And so we need to really leverage high educational content so that consumers are fully knowledgeable and know exactly what they're getting and exactly why they're getting it. And so an example is I work with Costa Rica. They're a high quality olive oil, very premium, early harvest, cold pressed, et cetera. And one thing that we flipped is instead of coming here and saying, cold pressed, early harvested, because a lot of consumers don't know what that means, we say stuff like high polyphenol count, which means high antioxidants, which means heart health, which means skin health, which means hair health. And so we have consumers that are already coming to our site going, "Oh, I want healthy hair. That's as easy as adding high quality olive oil. I know why I'm purchasing." And so when they're on site, they're already, they already have their questions answered and they can just hit purchase and then get back to scrolling on whichever channels they are to entertain themselves. Most buying, I believe, happens now when we're kind of in like a relaxation mode during the day. And I want our consumers to stay in that relaxation mode as much as possible because then the buying pattern feels very natural to them as opposed to pulling them out of it and then them having to get back into it.
One of the things that we talk about too is the importance of the psychological aspects of buying, right? And how strong those pulls are against people of dealing with their fears, their uncertainties, their doubts. And they exist no matter what kind of purchase you're making. Certainly, there are certain purchases that are higher consideration where the emotional or financial risk is higher, and therefore those pulls are perhaps stronger. But if a product is new, those pulls are strong, right? Because there's a higher level of uncertainty as to like, what is this? Why should I buy this instead of these other brands that I'm far more familiar with that I've seen for years or perhaps have even been buying for years? So you have an interesting challenge, and I'd love for you to talk about it for a second. How do you balance that need to say, okay, I need to take this educational information to begin to bring down that uncertainty, to reduce those fears and those doubts and push that out into an ad without overwhelming the ad, right? And still allowing them to kind of come through the process of the post-click experience to continue that, right? To bring it low in the ad, to continue keeping that anxiety low as they go through the conversion funnel and ultimately to buy. How do you kind of balance that between the pre-click and the post-click?
With all of the brands that I work with, it really starts off with building qualified personas to advertise to. And once we have those personas, then we can get really precise with some of our problem solution messaging And then it gets really simple in terms of, we're not trying to sell you on every feature that this product has. We're trying to sell you on this one feature that solves this exact problem for one of our exact personas. And that's kind of how we balance the pre-click and the post-click is we understand, I might buy something for a completely different reason than you buy it, right? But that one product solves both of those problems, and that problem is in the advertisement is directed towards you, and my problem is directed towards me. And then the post-click quantifies both of those reasonings. And so we kind of split it up. We take this giant idea of, this product does all of this stuff. And it's all right, well, let's cut off this pie, push it over here, cut off this pie, push it over here. And then we can bring it all together again.
A lot of CPG brands do something similar, right? Except what they typically do is they kind of slap a different label on it, right? You think about toothpaste and all the different types of toothpaste out there for gum health, for teeth whitening, right? For kind of all these different aspects of it. And I mean, I can't prove this. I think it's all the same stuff, right? I think they're just talking to people who say, yeah, my dentist said I had problems with my gums, so I should buy this one for gum health. Oh, yeah, I need to get my teeth whitened, so I need to, buy this one for teeth whitening, right? So they're just kind of painting these different labels on the same product ultimately to say, okay, I'm talking to different groups of people who have different needs, and you're kind of doing the same thing, except instead of slapping a different label on it, you're just saying, I'm going to highlight the different aspects and benefits of my product to these different audiences. So I can imagine a lot of your work is building out those different audience segments and tweaking and optimizing for those different segments to make sure that you're speaking to each audience segment in the right way that's going to help them feel comfortable at that initial click, and then keep them comfortable all the way through the process. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, yes, it is. It is very accurate. What's I think a little bit more interesting is the way the ad platforms are going. All of that is starting to happen at the creative level instead of the precise targeting level. And so, throughout the years, a few years ago, it was, we're going to build this campaign to target, gym goers who go to this gym. And then we're going to build this one to target people who travel. And nowadays you can still do that. I typically don't recommend it. I'd much rather just do a broad, include all of them, but I'm going to build specific creative within that campaign that speaks to gym goers, and then other specific creative that speaks to travel enthusiasts, and let the algorithm say, okay, this campaign now has, theoretically a million people in it, more than that, but theoretically a million. These 300,000 need to see the gym. These 300,000 need to see the travel, and that's going to handle our targeting. And then in that, you give the campaign, especially when you're working with smaller brands that have lighter budgets, you give the campaign the most amount of events to happen, to learn off of. And so you have a brand that doesn't have to segment, 25 campaigns on Meta at $100 a day. And these campaigns are just throwing darts blindly. You have one campaign where they're very precise, saying, okay, for, these red darts, we throw it this way. And for these green darts, we throw it this way. And for these orange ones, we throw them this way. And that's really where we've gone to building our campaigns with our clients that have that level of spend. It's really all in the creative in specific messaging.
Awesome. That's great insight for the audience. I think that's great tips of things that we can begin to try and kind of think about that a little bit differently, that perhaps can garner more efficiency. And as you say, kind of really maximize the power of the algorithm and the inherent desire of these companies and their algorithms to say, hey, look, I want to maximize your impressions and your clicks, because that's where I'm making my money, right? So I want to do my best to serve those up to the right audiences, and leveraging creative as a means to do that in very different ways. What has you done this? Has you tweaked this process? Has you used it? And then as you look at other people and how they're doing it, what mistakes do you see they're making in terms of how they're leveraging their ad strategy and how they're making that connection, or perhaps not making that connection between the ad click and that landing page to go through to the conversion point?
A lot of brands are lazy in their briefing. I think a lot of brands want to sit on top 500 hooks of 2025 and work their way through all 500 and then be like, oh, this one, that's an unboxing, worked really well. And we do things a little bit differently, where we're building our hooks to our personas to directly speak to them, right? Like there's really no guesswork in our creative building. We know exactly what's going to go. And so we drive it off there. And then I see a lot of brands on their landing pages wanting to stuff so much information into their pages and overwhelming consumers with messages that aren't necessarily relevant to them. Um, I've worked with a handful of brands that they want to put every single feature that the product has on these landing pages and then give an element for each feature and how it helps you and how it does this and how it does that. And it's just too much information. I worked with an allergy client for a long time, and they had a great landing page strategy where it was very specific. If you're coming in for pet allergies, all you're seeing is pet allergies. If you're coming in for food allergies, all you're seeing is food allergies. And then it even got smaller as if you're coming in for peanut allergies, all you're seeing is peanut allergy information. If you're coming in for milk allergies or dairy, all you're seeing is dairy. And so it's this hyper-focused messaging that's so individualized to the consumer that if I come in and I have this kind of small question that's personalized to me, I can find it on that landing page, as opposed to being forced to make a connection by being like, okay, well, this product has this feature that might do this. And then if that does that, then that helps me with my problem. It's all right there. I have the answer right in front of me.
So has you kind of thought about this? Has you seen what others are doing, what works for you and what doesn't, and what is not really working for other brands? You've gotten yourself to the point where you mentioned to me before, you've got 60 to 80% of your spend or your budget really focused on acquisition. What kind of got you to that level of spend, and that percentage of spend has been kind of that sweet spot, so to speak, to be focused on acquisition?
Yeah, it sounds really simple and basic. But I had an old mentor tell me, you can't grow a business on returning customers. And I feel like that's something that oftentimes we forget about because we're so locked into the numbers and we see like, oh, it only costs us $10 to bring back a customer, but it costs us 75 to bring a new one in. Why are we spending 75? And so, I've kind of always launched my career with, we need to be growing with new customers. Absolutely. And so most of the brands that I work with sit at about a 60 to 80% acquisition. And most of that is because they're a growing brand and they need to find that new customer revenue. Um, that fluctuates a little bit if we're a little bit more established brand and we have significant customer data. We'll go a little bit back, and then we'll fluctuate with goals sometimes. So like we've worked with brands where Q2 is really difficult from a new customer acquisition. There's just a lot of seasonality, and so in Q2 we might sit at like a 40% acquisition, 60% returning because there's a ton of past customers and we can re-engage with them and they know the product. And then come Q3, we flip that to do like more of a 60-40 and bring in some of those new customers. So really it's individualized to the brand and understanding their goals and where they're at in their journey as a brand.
You make a very good point because, as you mentioned, that may fluctuate, that percentage, but the principle, right, is sound. And whether that percentage may be higher because it's a startup, it's a newer brand, it may maybe come down a bit with an enterprise brand, with a very established brand with a lot of brand awareness and integrity already built in. Even the most established brand rarely, if ever, has 100% customer retention, right? And that kind of brings to the point, you've got to be looking at both, right? What are you doing in terms of new customer generation, and what are you doing in terms of customer retention? And I think brands, even the largest of them, get caught in the trap of, well, what are we doing in paid media? What are we doing in email? What are we doing in social? And it's like, well, those things aren't the end. Those things aren't the end. They're the means to the end, right? They're tools to help you either acquire new customers or retain your customers. So the question really should be, what are we doing to acquire new customers? What are we doing to retain our existing customers? And then how are we leveraging these channels to accomplish those goals as tools and levers to accomplish those goals? All too often we see generic ads going out there, little, if any, retargeting going on, or generic retargeting ads, email blasts, essentially, where it's just the same email and you're getting bombarded every day in your inbox. And it's like, there's no thought of like, well, who is this going to? Am I trying to win a new person? Am I trying to retain an existing person? What do I know about that person, right? Those questions aren't being asked because they're asking the wrong question to begin with, right? They're starting in the wrong place and not really looking at the different channels. So in your experience, how How do you think about channels, and how do you build alignment across those multiple channels?
First starts off with the brand and what the brand's goals are. I'll give you an example. I work with a client right now who is almost entirely focused on acquisition because they don't have a product, because their product is almost lifelong. Like once you buy it, you almost have it forever, and they don't really have something for people to come back to. And so they're entirely new customer focused. And so at that point, almost every message is about our hero product and why that hero product is needed, what it does for you, how it eases up your life, et cetera, because we're really only targeting new customers. And that product is really good. But I work with another brand whose almost 80% of their customers come in on their hero product. And so almost all retargeting or remarketing to past customers is done with non-hero products. You know, let's cross-sell in this other category. Let's get them to come back and try this. Let's get them to do this. And all of our acquisition is done with that hero product and you know, product led first, et cetera. But that's kind of really how we look at that. From my standpoint, I traditionally like to prioritize paid for customer acquisition. You know, you can just get in front of more eyes. You pay for it, of course. It's easier. But working in the startup world, I've worked with so many brands that you jump on with them and they go, we only want to do paid for customer acquisition. We don't want to spend on retargeting. And you take a look at their numbers and you go, you're only pulling back 10% of your past purchasers. You're never going to sustain this. It's impossible. You can't do it. So we have to remarket. And I think in today's world, there's just so many options out there. If you're not paying to remarket to your past purchasers, they're going to go somewhere else. There's too many options. There's too many deals. There's too many discounts. Money's tight for everybody. Unless you really have somebody that has purchased from you over and over and over again and really built that brand loyalty, it is not hard to lose them. And therapy is really expensive, quote, expensive for brands once you lose that person to bring them back. It is much cheaper to take that person on a date once every week and build that loyalty than it is to try to win them back at the end.
People are scrolling, right? There's so many things there's bombarding them, and we've become a culture. You know, this is a whole other discussion, right? But we become a culture of instant gratification, right? Where it's like, what's in front of me now, right? That's what's grabbing my attention. And you spent this initial money as a brand to get people over those initial humps of those psychological levers, right? Those fears, those uncertainties. You've gotten them over that hump, and now you're not investing in maintaining that, right? If you're going to abandon that, then like you had no foundation on which to build a business, because now you're constantly fighting that battle of trying to get people over the hump. And then when you spend the money to actually do it, it's like you're throwing that investment in the trash, and you're just saying, well, let's just start over again. And it's just like, well, like, what are we doing here, right? I mean, you're just handing them over to someone else, perhaps even handing over some of what you've done and what you've accomplished psychologically to potentially another brand who's now front of mind and getting their attention, right? So important to do that. Now, I know a big aspect of this for you is, of course, not just the creative, not just the strategy, and not just the psychology of it, but also the metrics of it. And even your metrics and how you looked at measurement has evolved. You started with the more typical return on ad spend, or ROAS. You've looked at a mirror model, gone to a tacos model. Can you kind of talk about that evolution and that growth for those different ways of measuring, and why you've kind of evolved over time in terms of how you look at measuring return?
The reality is brands need to be moving towards an MER or tacos. They're the same. They're just inverse model, because attribution is so murky in today's world. Exactly like you said, Meta wants to take credit for every single purchase, and Google wants to take credit for every single purchase. And then you've got affiliate out there taking credit for purchase. And then you've got an influencer that you worked with taking credit for purchase, and email. And so you have all of these channels that are overlapping and truthfully should be overlapping, because it takes multiple touch points for a consumer to purchase. But it gets really murky to really understand, is Meta propelling my business forward? Is Google propelling my business forward? Are we doing the right things on email to be driving, acquisition or returning customers, et cetera? And so I really kind of, in your career, it evolves. I really evolved into the sense of I want to get away from paid and into our company's growing. And I think that's where like an MER or a tacos number helps you stay focused on your holistic growth and a holistic profitable growth on top of that. And then you can do some tests within that, where you say, okay, we're gonna, Google ROAS looks incredible. It's 2x what Meta is. We're gonna 2x our Google spend, and we're gonna see where our MER sits at the end of the month. We're gonna see how many new customers we bring in. Oh, look at that. MER decreased 30%. Okay. Google's probably taking additional credit that they don't deserve, and another channel needs to be tested out. That's really where I've gone and where I think most brands need to be going to, because otherwise you're just going to get lost in this channel's ROAS versus this channel's ROAS and this channel's ROAS and this channel's ROAS without focusing on how they all intertwine and work together.
Yeah, I've really come to believe, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, that this chasing of attribution has become this death spiral, right? And I've really come to believe it's a zero-sum game. It's just like, there's no one's going to win this. It's just, there's too many touch points. There's too many different ways. There's too many different devices people interact. And there are technologies that do a great job of trying to stitch those things together across different devices, across different touch points and measure that. But in the end, really, those are still guesses, right? I mean, we're guessing on a lot of that. I mean, there's too many things that automatically turn off cookies. There's people who delete cookies. There's, again, people who are switching devices. They're using other people's devices. They're navigating at work. They're using a work device, a work mobile device, which has a different, like, there's just too much going on to really end up, you end up getting caught in this death spiral, this zero-sum game. And it's just like, now it's taking you down this dark hole. And it's just like you're missing the big picture, which you stated, which is like, are things growing? Are we gaining new customers? Are we retaining our existing customers, right? Those are the ultimate metrics that kind of roll up to impact the performance of the company, which is really what we care about. Because I don't know a CFO who cares at all about like, well, how much of this came from Meta? Like, how much of this came from Google? They don't care. Like, they just want to know how much are we spending and what's the return on that overall spend and what we're driving. And when it comes to things like brand and PR, which are far more difficult to quantify, when we look at those things more holistically, now all of a sudden it becomes, okay, this is how much we're spending and we're seeing the overall return. As a marketer, my job is to say, how do I kind of move these levers and get that right mix to really maximize that return, right? And that's going to be, and that's a constant game. It's not going to be like, oh, I found the right mix. Okay, I'm good. I don't have to touch this for a year. It's a constant game because the market's in constant flux. People are constantly changing. Your competitors are doing different things. So it's a constant game. So I think your way of looking at it is far more efficient and effective. Do you find that this kind of digging into that attribution to be that same death spiral that I do?
Yeah, 100%. Like 1,000%. I always say like, I don't need to know attribution 100%, right? Like I don't need to know it 100%. I need to know it directionally so that it can inform my decisions and our strategy to grow businesses. I'll give you an example. This happens all the time with early stage brands that see Google having, 3x the ROAS that Meta has, but not being able to understand a lot of consumers will find your product on Meta, through Instagram, through Facebook, and then they'll search it on Google. They'll come through a Google paid, they'll purchase. And so Google will take that last click attribution and say, we're so responsible for this. We did this. This is amazing. And what they'll do is they'll move funds from Meta into Google. And then slowly they'll start to see their Google ROAS decrease. And then they're sitting here and they're going, well, what's going on? What happened? And it's, your channels are playing together. They're working together. Your Meta is driving Google purchases. So, I don't necessarily need to know, what is my return on Meta and what is my return on Google. I need to know holistically, how much does it cost us to bring a new customer through paid? And I need to know the spend on both of those channels, because if it's too much, then we need to adjust. If it's, way below our goal and we're killing it, then amazing. We need to spend more. So, directionally, I need to know where to go, but I don't need to know 100%. And the truth is, I did a LinkedIn post about this the other day. I don't think you need an attribution solution. I think they're great tools. I think they're great to have. They muddy the water a bit. But if you don't understand your attribution without one, you're not going to understand your attribution with one. They are not this golden ticket that all of a sudden opens up your business to all of this other stuff. You have to understand it from a channel reported level into a Shopify or whatever else you're using level, into a holistic business level before you jump into a attribution solution like Triple Whale to say, okay, now our data is a little bit nicer. It's a little bit less muddy, but what is it actually telling us? Is it telling us the same thing that it was telling us before? Which more often than not, if you're good at this, it's going to tell you the exact same thing. It might just look a little bit prettier.
Sam, we'll leave you with this question. If you were going to give one piece of advice, one thing to say, hey, enterprise marketers, here's a takeaway from the startup world that I think really translates to the enterprise world that I think you'll see good impact on implementing or trying today, this week, this month, whatever the case may be. What would that one thing be?
The way that I like to think about my advertising is it's kind of split into different buckets. And one of those buckets is iterating on new ideas. Another bucket is testing new ideas that we're pretty sure are going to work. And then another bucket that I think is really important is taking big swings. And I think a lot of enterprise brands play it really safe with, okay, we know this messaging works for us. We're going to iterate on this messaging 50 times. And they should be doing that, right? That keeps your results steady. But when working with early stage brands, I'm not necessarily looking to keep things steady, right? I want to find those things that jump us from a 1x to a 3x and then a 3x to a 4x, right? I want to keep things steady while we look for that. And so I'm always iterating on what's working, but I'm also always kind of taking these swings in ways that we haven't messaged the product in different ideas that, sound a little kooky and a little weird and might be a little bit out there, to see if we can find these jumps. And then I'm also always, iterating on new ideas that are talking to the specific personas that we want to talk to. But that would be my biggest thing is, don't get so caught up in what has worked that you're not looking for the next thing that's going to work.
That's great advice. Sam, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you being on. I really appreciate you sharing your experience and your insights and kind of bringing that startup mentality to the enterprise world where it can be so impactful.
I appreciate it, Shamir. I really had a blast and I hope the listeners learned something. I feel like every time I talk to smart marketers, I learn something. So I definitely learned a lot from you on this one too.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you, Sam.
Appreciate it.